Welcome to the Startup Grind.
What I want to do is, luckily most of you have already met Benjamin, but Benjamin Ellis is our speaker for today. So thank you very much, Benjamin, for coming along. And he has described himself, I believe, on your website as a social technologist and serial entrepreneur, which means that he sells cornflakes.
Absolutely. Well, I think I'm very careful never to describe myself as that, but it's certainly a phrase that other people use about me a lot.
It's there a lot, yes. And so what I thought, we had a quick chat on what we could and couldn't say beforehand. And thanks very much for coming.
Yeah.
So
everyone's signing NDAs. That's
absolutely,
how we do
absolutely. So the thing we thought we would start with is when Benjamin was 5 and stubbed his toe. It was a very entrepreneurial moment. So from 17, I'm going to shut up and let you go for the early days of your entrepreneurial life, heading into, your Silicon Valley moments. So if you want to start.
I very rarely talk about the early days, but I think it's good to talk about. I tried my first startup at 17 with 3 schoolmates, and we had absolutely no idea what we were doing. Unfortunately, we didn't lose anybody any money, and we never quite got to market with our first product, but it was definitely a learning experience. And I think at that point, there was very little infrastructure to help somebody who wanted to start a business. Certainly Silicon Valley wasn't really a thing, or not visible over here in the UK anyway. But definitely learned some lessons from that. Headed off to university. Got very involved in the internet there, was kind of fascinated by it and kind of hacking mainframes and those sorts of things.
So share why you went to Kent University, I think, Benjamin. That was quite an interesting point, wasn't it? You're allowed to say that?
I spent a lot of my teenage years kind of getting access to mainframe systems, which wasn't illegal at the time, and discovering this thing called the internet. And really the big places in the UK for the internet at the time was Imperial College, or Kent University, which was actually where all the undersea cables came in and where all the email came into the UK. So I was like, I will go there. And I was moonlighting, doing all sorts of startup stuff with some UK tech companies at the time. And it so happened that the person who interviewed me for my university place was somebody I'd been selling to the day before. So it's like, you've got a bit of get up and go, we'll get you in here. So that's what ended me up there. And it turned out to be a good place to be. The first internet service provider in the UK launched out of Kent, and a lot of the early internet stuff kind of started off there. And interestingly, when I got to the end of university, I was very much like, I will do this startup thing, another business idea. And in those days, we had Business Link, if anyone's old enough to remember those things. And a very elderly gentleman talked about his 250-person company and their £6 million a year turnover. And it never quite kind of connected with where I was as an individual trying to start off a business. So I kind of passed on that one. But then ended up in startups pretty much by accident. So I got recruited out into industry after lecturing. And one of the directors of that company, which went on to be what became City Financial Services, wanted to go off and do a startup. And they said, well, we'll fund that. And they did a spin out. And I tell you, it's the best way to do a startup, if you can get involved in the spin out, because you've got all of the fun and none of the risk. And so it was a great way to understand what's involved in setting up a business basically from scratch. The hiring was really easy, because we just wandered around the office going, yeah, they're really good, we'll have them, and we'll have them, and we'll have them. As part of building a very interesting business there.
Can I just interject? I'm pretty sure everyone in this room knows what a spin-out is, but basically it's when a big company kind of fires off a little meteorite of little company and kind of creates a sub-mini company that goes off and does its own kind of thing in an entrepreneurial way. With how many restraints? Were you restrained at all, or was it fairly off you go?
Not a lot. We had a pretty strong leader who knew what he wanted and made sure that he got it, as strong leaders often do. So, and we launched with a first customer as well, which I think is one of the other things about any kind of startup business. If you can launch with a customer, you're away, because that's always the hardest thing. And a customer is not the person going, I really like what you're doing, I'm fantastically interested.
That's your mum.
Yeah, that's your mum. Your mum, dad, brother, sister. It's the person who's actually stuck their hand in their wallet or gone to the finance director and got you a PO. Because until that money's gone across the table, they're just interested. And again, I think that was one of my early lessons. It's like, particularly in our culture, people go, we should talk more about that. Especially VCs will always do that. That's a very interesting idea. We should talk again in a few months.
Splendid.
Splendid idea. Come back and talk again. They never want to say no, and nobody wants to be the person who says no. So I think getting that early feedback with money coming in, or even hard no's, that's just as valuable. People going, can't do that, won't buy that. Yeah. We had a good kind of ramp from that point of view.
Okay, and you learned quite a lot from that.
We should. More big businesses should do spin-outs, actually. It's in their interest as well. It's interesting with Centrica now doing Hive. That we're kind of seeing more of that here. It is a very, very good model for innovation and a great way to get people kind of started in startups at very low risk.
And you possibly sort of started talking about things like culture and stuff at this time, or is that something you developed later?
Yeah, we kind of inherited. I think one of the challenging things about spin-out is you do inherit the parent culture. Which means it's not as startup as it could be. So my first real experience of Silicon Valley culture was a phone call at about 11 p.m. one night from a chap from the US who was like, well, we've got this company and we're setting up in Europe and we want to hire somebody to kind of do the Europe thing for us. Are you interested? It's like, who is this strange American man talking to me and what is this all about? And we talked for probably an hour and a half. I was like, this actually sounds quite exciting. And that was a company called TGV, was about 120 people in Santa Cruz, which was a fantastic location. And it was the proper startup.
You actually described earlier as a small startup.
Yeah,
I found it interesting because, I'm struggling to get over 8 people in a team, it's still, so.
I think that's one of the interesting things about kind of UK versus US is that issue of scale. And an advantage that US businesses have always had is the fact that you've got a massive home market, so you can raise a lot of money and you can get to a native market really quickly. So they get to scale quite bigly. So you very rarely kind of stuck at that small stage. I think here we tend to start a bit smaller. That's not a bad thing, but I think later on it was a valuable lesson for me that actually kind of going from 1 to 2 people, it's really, really hard. And 4 to 5. Going from 12 to 20 is not such a big deal, and those inflection points in the business really get further and further apart. And the difference between 250 people and 4,000 is remarkably small, interestingly. Yeah. Just to cheer you up with that one.
I was going to say that. And so what happened to TGV?
So TGV was a great fun kind of running around, selling this US company's products to anybody who would listen in Europe and getting to do everything, which is a real fun thing. We had eventually kind of 3 of us in Europe, and we did everything. We put the paper into the printer, help police force fix their networks, all sorts of great fun things. You did absolutely everything. You did sales, you did pre-sales, you did tech. And then we got acquired by a company called Cisco, who I hadn't really heard of at the time. In fact, not many people had.
I don't know who they are now.
No idea who they are. Where are they? They're around here somewhere. And when I joined, literally the phone list for Europe was like written up on a post-it note. It was very, very small. It was only a few years away from pretty much kind of growing, where the engineers were kind of sticking parts on their credit card to kind of go and get stuff. Very, very entrepreneurial, very small, very fast-moving. And TGV was one of the early acquisitions, and it went on to do a lot of acquisitions, and that was its kind of growth model. And it was a fantastic place to learn about fast-growing business as well. John Chambers was a fantastic CEO, and they had some amazingly talented people that they brought into the business.
And from your perspective, you were quite involved with the acquisitions and sort of onboarding them from a startup perspective.
Yeah, that was their model of onboarding technology, was to acquire companies. So in bringing them in, we had to go through a process of make sure the right people stay, make sure the wrong people find something more exciting to do, getting the technology into the marketplace, whether it's through Cisco's existing channels, or for some of them, we would build kind of virtual sales teams to get that out to market. Yeah. Very interesting model, very strict operating model in the business as well, in terms of being number 1 or 2 in the market or not playing, and being very aggressive about that, but very strategic as well. And I think a lot of what I learned there was the kind of difference between kind of tactics and making really big strategic plays, which again, for a startup, that's your kind of bread and butter. What's your strategic difference? Because most stuff can be copied. Yeah. And strategy is really about saying, I'm prepared to lose at this, this, and this, so that I win this other thing that potentially other people don't think is really valuable. And there's a real art to that, but that's what you depend on as a startup.
Yeah. And so Cisco, maybe we can get into firewalls later,
Yeah.
but we'll move on to that.
Yeah.
So a little bit of quirk on terms of how to sell firewalls into being 3 years late into the market for selling firewalls. But I'm quite interested in what happened next because you had a bit of fun.
I did. So a bunch of us decided it would be really great to do a kind of Silicon Valley style startup in the UK, which seemed like a really good idea. And we broke our backs raising money, and we had a great team with an amazing track record in terms of the folks we had helping us do that. We raised about $35 million in cash, but in hindsight, if we'd done that in the US, we would have raised significantly more. And the pressure was always on us as well to move to the US. So even after we'd got those successive rounds of funding, everyone's like, relocate to the US and we'll fund you really big. So it took a lot to stay.
How long did it actually take you to get that 35 million, and what did you use it for?
Parties, of course.
Parties.
This was that decade. No, it took a long while. And it was an amazing scale of business. Our customer base was predominantly the telcos, so it's one of those things where you need a lot of cash behind you to go and sell to those people.
Yeah.
One of my observations for startups is try and sell to people like you. It's the easiest thing. Trying to, as a small organisation, sell to a big one is phenomenally painful. But we decided to do that, and we mastered it. But we did that through partnerships. So we kind of leveraged up. So predominantly we would sell through like a Motorola or an Alcatel and let them handle the pain of the contracting and those sorts of things.
And the trust factor, or was it because you were all ex-Cisco, they believed in you?
There was a lot of that, but also we needed that channel in place in that model, because if we were selling direct, it wouldn't have happened. Whereas for them, again, it's a trick as a startup. If you can bootstrap off of somebody else's sales process, it's going to save you a lot of time and paperwork. If they've already got the relationship in place, particularly obviously in the B2B space, that's the way to go.
Yeah, and that's still going, isn't it?
That startup is still going. So we had kind of lots of excitement around funding. I think one of my observations around VC-backed businesses is it's kind of addictive. So once you've raised VC money, you need more VC money because you build the business out to a burn rate. And again, VCs, deliberately or otherwise, will always make sure that you're pretty close to running out of cash.
Yeah.
And so that means you've got to raise successive rounds of money. We did that at a point of kind of 9/11. That impacted directly on the people who were funding us. So we had to very dramatically change the direction of the business.
Yeah.
So
you were actually getting funding at that very point, weren't you?
We were
on the very day.
A growth round. So we had a fantastic customer base, great revenue stream, but we needed more cash to fund the business. So we had to kind of reject that plan and go for plan B, which was a really dramatic readjustment and a good learning lesson for me, because in the 90s and through the kind of early 2010s, everything kind of went okay. It didn't matter what you did, it tended to kind of grow pretty much. And so that kind of realization that there's a downside to startup life as well. So I was involved in interviewing everybody that we'd hired into the business at that point. It's kind of one of my passions around keeping culture really consistent, and doing that by having a consistent set of people who bring people into the business. And then I had to lay them off. And that's probably one of the hardest things I've ever done, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you then had a very strange conversation, which I want to spend some time on this because I'm interested in the next stage in your career. Scott, could you just quickly either turn that
Twiddle
microphone
the magic thing
away, slightly pointing towards the windows a bit. So you had been on the radar of someone in America, in their garage.
Yeah, so, and again, this is one of the things, I think once you're in startup land, it's all about the startups you were at before and those sorts of things. So a bunch of the Cisco guys had gone off to found this little business in a kind of literally in a garage over in the valley, who were determined to take on Cisco, who by that point had become a kind of absolute behemoth, massive. And I'd had a number of conversations with them and gone, seems kind of...
I mean, the very concept of, we're going to take on Cisco is quite mad, isn't it?
And to do that, selling to the carriers. And I just come from an environment of learning what it was like to sell to telcos who are, love them dearly, but they are the slowest moving businesses on the planet, and with good reason. Physical assets, lots of process, painful. And so that this is the way we're going to do it. We're going to sell to these guys. It's like, Oh, okay.
Really?
Really.
So that was quite a learning curve, wasn't it, in terms of going about it?
Yeah, so that was a company called Juniper Networks, who I was very fortunate to join in kind of pretty early days.
Yeah.
Phenomenal team, amazing CEO who's very good at teaching people as well, very good. In the early days of the business, Andy Grove from Intel was a mentor as well, and kind of left an amazing legacy of kind of how to think and behave strategically. And we took on Cisco and won.
Yeah, incredible.
Which was, again, the power of strategy over tactics and kind of placing big bets and letting them win.
Yeah. And were there some big bets that, in reality, on a different day, it could have all gone wrong?
I think you've always got that. I think we were joking earlier on outside. There's two really good times to do something, which was yesterday and tomorrow. And you can always do things differently with hindsight. But actually, I think we executed really well. And it was one of the things of doing what you can do as a startup that big businesses can't do.
Yeah.
So, marketing tactics. We did some pretty snarky cartoons in the press, directly targeting them as a competitor, which really wound them up.
Yeah.
Cost us very little money, got a huge amount of attention, and it was something that they couldn't do.
Yeah.
And lots of people said, well, we don't really like the adverts. It's like, it doesn't matter. You talk about us, you know the name.
Yeah.
And again, as a startup, that visibility is key. People knowing the name, kind of picking a spot. In terms of sales process, if people have heard the name of your business before they meet you, before you try and sell, your chances of closing that deal are an order of magnitude higher than if they've never heard of you when you walk in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's actually called the Mars bar effect, but I'll talk about that another day.
That sounds intriguing.
It's before you eat it, while you eat it, after you eat it. But never mind.
We'll
talk later.
And learning as well about guerrilla marketing tactics, which I think now with the kind of richness of digital marketing we've got around us is kind of the thing that you can do things like, take a billboard advert outside out with a big customer. We knew who we were targeting. We could reach them very cost effectively. They would have heard of us. Oh, I don't know why, but I've heard of you guys. Yeah, there's a massive advert outside of your building. It's the only advert we've got in the entire country. But those kind of tricks were phenomenally effective and have used time and time again.
Yeah. And so you're picking up all these entrepreneurial skills. You've still got this burning desire to do more entrepreneurial things. And you get called into something called Sci-Tech, which I couldn't write down for a reason.
Yeah,
I don't know why.
This is what happens when you let English folks name companies. And naming is one of the hardest things, by the way. And I think of setting up companies, probably doing the naming thing has been the hardest thing always.
It's like coming up with a name for a band.
Yeah. Well, we did one, for one of the 3i-backed businesses we did for a long while. It was called VLE Systems brackets must think of a better name.
Excellent.
Before it ended up as a virtual access name. On Juniper grew. Again, we initially kind of product led, and then we started to make a lot of acquisitions, and it very quickly got to the point I kind of woke up one day and it was at the kind of 4,000 or 5,000 person mark. It's like, do you know what? This is not a startup anymore. At that point, previous VCs had kind of mentioned a business that was again a spin out that they wanted to effectively kind of pivot and work towards a trade sale. So I was like, I'm up for that. And it turned out to be a very interesting journey. It was a spin out from BT, really, really super bright BT engineers, and a lot of psychology involved in what they did as well, which is kind of where the name came from, Sci-Tech. And so that was applying a lot of the kind of old skills around identifying kind of a new route to a different market, changing the price point of what they did, and positioning the company to make it valuable to potential acquisitors. And again, that's never an end. So again, if you ever come across somebody who's like, I'm building this business to sell it, that's not going to end well for them. But conversely, as you're building your business, if that is going to be your path, you need to think about how you're going to exit it so you don't make it undigestible.
Yeah.
And I've watched people do that a lot of times. And again, as startups, a lot of the time you're fighting to make the best decision that day.
Yeah.
And actually you need to make the best decision for that day that's going to work for the subsequent days. Again, particularly with things like funding. When you close a round of funding, you're closing off a whole bunch of options.
Right.
And so you need to think about, well, where's my next 2 sets of funding coming from? If you're closing a deal with a customer that you're really excited, hey, it's our first big deal, ask yourself, okay, once that tiger's in the building, How do I get the next couple of tigers in, and what's the consequence of that? And it's that whole, you've got to be a couple of steps ahead in order to survive, because just making the right decision for today is not enough as a startup. You've got to keep those options open down the line and think very strategically around what you're doing, because that's your strength as a startup. The fact that you've got a lot more flexibility in decisions, so it's a lot more important about the decisions that you make.
Yeah, you don't have as many committees to go to ease the burden of responsibility.
Yeah. Although on the flip side, and I kind of note on that, is always have some external influence.
Right.
I think that's something that I learned early on. It's great to be in a startup and be very excited about what you're doing, but always have somebody kind of outside the ring who comes in occasionally.
Not your mum.
Yeah, not your mum. Who will call it like it is and say, hey guys, what are you doing? This is utterly mad.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you can end up in a bit of groupthink around what you're doing. So having somebody come in and go, what's this all about, is really, really important. And again, that they're not in the day-to-day.
Yeah.
It's got to be somebody who's not in the day-to-day, because you get caught up in what's going off and caught up in that belief system. It's somebody who can be a reality check.
And we were talking about business mentors and coaches earlier as a useful asset.
Yeah, and again, it might not be somebody under that title. It might be a former boss who is kind of pretty sane. It could be your mum.
Yeah.
It might be your partner. It's somebody who's kind of outside of the ring, who can come in with a clean perspective and go, what is this all about? And call time on stuff.
So it was quite a good moment, because you talked about culture and stuff earlier, and that was a culture event for you as well, because there was quite a lot of getting that back to its core. Why did we do this in the first place? What are we doing? As well as all the other great stuff that went with it. And so you've kind of taken all that stuff, done very well, and moved into more out of the sort of, this is a physical product, and into more software as a service and
so gradually transitioned. So Cisco is very much, although it was really a software business, it did that embodied in hardware. And I've predominantly been in hardware businesses. It's kind of interesting now that the whole hardware thing's kind of coming back around. So I'm excited about that. That's like, I know stuff about that. I have nightmares about Dove power supplies still to this day. But starting to move into software-based businesses where you've got a lot more flexibility. You've not got capital tied up in plant. You can get started really quickly. You don't need VC money. And I think there are alternative models. And I was really kind of captivated by the idea of kind of bootstrapping and doing things cash constrained quite deliberately.
Yeah. So that was quite interesting for me, because we'd had the conversation. I mean, obviously, you've been working with some incredible growth and had a successful time of it. And then when you came to be doing the three things that we're going to talk about, you said to me, but I didn't want VC funding. And actually, that's something that, people knock on your door and ask to give you money, don't they? Yeah. So you're in that position, but you didn't want it. And I think that was a really important thing, because you didn't want, what didn't you want?
Yeah, so it's about kind of phases of the market. So we tend to go through cycles where opportunities emerge and there's a lot of uncertainty, and then other ones where there's kind of an execution path that you want to move really fast because you know what's happening. And I think particularly at that point in time, the world was changing. The internet kind of growth bubble had kind of done its thing and pretty much run its mile. So it's kind of, what's emerging next? And I had some kind of ideas around that, but wanted to be able to experiment. And the challenge around raising VC money, and whilst it's great if you can do it and have that opportunity, is that you've bought into the VC's agenda at that point. So that the VC has to exit that fund at some point. They need their money back. That's what they're there for. They're not there to be your friend or even for you to have a successful business. Yeah. They're there for you to exit at maximum value and whatever their cycle is, 5 years down the line or whatever. Yeah. And whatever it takes to do that. The interesting thing about doing it the other way around, about being cash constrained, again, there are plays where you need the cash. Yeah. Right? If you've got a hardware-based business, you've got inventory, you've got those sorts of things. If you're doing a moonshot business where you've got to get to number one in the market and it's all about speed of execution, you need capital. If you're doing a business where you're exploring and learning, particularly if it's a software business, that doesn't take a lot of money. Yeah. And it's not a small amount of money, but it doesn't take a VC size of money. And it takes a level of money that's just not interesting to a VC. Yeah. So for them, there's a level below which it's not cost effective to go fund you because they just end up with loads of deals. So wanted to explore that and what the bounds of that are. I think learnings are, it takes a lot longer to do stuff when you're bootstrapped, but it makes you really focused on a business model that works.
So you've set up RedCatCo.
Yeah.
let's go through them individually. So let's start with RedCatCo. So you've got three we're going to go into. One of them we can't quite go into as much detail as I wanted because you are actually now talking to people about VC funding. So, but RedCatCo, what does that do? What's it all about? Why? What's the belief and cause?
So I got, through Cytechnics, very interested in psychology, and particularly how you could apply computing to psychology and behavioral type things. And lots of people have said to me, well, have you got a product idea? It's like, well, I haven't got a product idea yet. I said, well, set up a consultancy and you'll find the product idea. So we did that with a view to, we'll set this up, very small group of us, and it will be for like 6 months, and then we'll kind of pivot to a product-based business. I kind of turned into the business that wouldn't go away. So we built our first product kind of pretty much a year in, and sold that to a large multinational, and then kind of brought on a number of others on that platform.
So just to clarify, so what were you actually consulting people on?
So we were consulting on how you could use digital technology to build and support culture. That was the kind of core thesis.
Right.
And again, you kind of pick up my passions around culture. All business problems generally fall into culture. All startup problems fall into culture. If your culture's wrong, you're not going to fix anything. If your culture's right, the other problems take care of themselves. You hire the right people, you do the right things. So it's kind of how you can use digital technology to scale that into a larger business. Because when you're a startup, when you're 120 people, everybody knows everybody.
Yeah.
Behaviors are tightly controlled. Generally, everybody who comes into the business has been interviewed by the CEO or MD, so you've got a really tight culture. When you get to a few thousand, that's not happening anymore, unless your CEO tends to be a kind of full-time HR person. You're not going there. And what happens is you get a step down. So you've got second generation, third generation people hiring people in, and the culture kind of goes for a wander unless you've got a strong narrative.
Yeah. Seeing it's rarely the HR person who tends to be the chief exec.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Not enough HR people knows. So that's what we did, but we kind of ended up building a platform to help people do that, to increase communication in the organization, and to take a lot of the ideas from social media and kind of run that inside of the organization.
Right.
And that was a good, fun journey and an interesting kind of learning around the dynamics of kind of software in the B2B space and moving from kind of packaged software to web-based software solutions.
Yep.
And that's really what spawned the next journey, which was SocialOptic,
right.
which was then taking that idea a step further in terms of how we can use the kind of digital soup in the organization to create and extract value.
Yeah. So the original product that you sort of developed within the first year, that's been sold off, or how many things is your bandwidth capable of keeping?
My bandwidth is going down on that one, and then it's extracting myself. That does its thing, and will run its course.
And so then SocialOptic, that is a spin-off from RedCatCo.
Yeah, so I kind of started off in parallel. So I have I don't know how many people are kind of in services business or products businesses, and I think that they're not really compatible. I think it's very difficult to do both under the same umbrella, because the mindset of what you're doing in a services-based business is you're adjusting to what the customer wants and meeting their need, which is great, and that's a model. You're generally capped on scaling by the people and talent that you've got. Yeah. In a product-based business, it's the opposite. It's like, this is a product, do you want it or not? And it's very difficult to mix those up, which is why a lot of agencies who try and build products really struggle, because they're in the service mindset of, let's adapt to this. Product businesses around, make a bet, and head off in that direction. That's kind of what we've done with SocialOptic. So some of the things around that are public, some not so much. So our first product was partly scratching our own itch, together with some other folks, a product called Milestone Planner, which is around a planning tool that works the way that startups and entrepreneurial businesses work, which is don't worry about the detail of your plan, just worry about what you're externally committing to.
Yeah.
Where do you need to get to? What are the milestones? Don't worry about the mechanics of the planning. Set some milestones so you can measure yourself.
Yeah.
Because again, as a startup, it's really difficult because your plan will change on a weekly basis. Yep. You've still got to hold yourself really accountable to that. Otherwise, you will go around in circles.
And how you get there completely changes from day one.
Yeah. And how you get there
doesn't
to
really
some
matter.
degree doesn't matter too much, other than whatever legacy it leaves in the business.
As long as you hit the milestone.
As long as you hit the milestone. Or an equivalent, a tradable equivalent. And that's something you kind of negotiate with your investors. If we did this thing instead of that thing, is that okay?
Yeah.
But it's got to be some forward movement.
So, I mean, the great thing is that you've been extremely successful along your career and lots to share. But in terms of starting up, so we've got quite a range of people in the room, some of which know lots of stuff and some who don't. And what would your sort of killer sort of top 5 thoughts? Top 3 doesn't have to be 5. Top 10.
Most useful things that it took me a long while to learn that people said to me. I think thing number 1 is get a cause, not a business, which sounds like a cliche, but it covers off a number of things. So get a cause, not a business, because people buy into a cause, they don't buy into a business. Having a cause will keep you going when stuff gets really, really tough.
Yeah.
And the business may pivot and change, the cause probably won't, and you can keep reconnecting back to that. And then as you bring people into the business, they connect with that cause. So if you look, Cisco, when I joined, was all about connect every network on the planet. Big, cause, go do it.
Yeah.
Microsoft was all about, PC on every desktop. These kind of some big social impact that you can attach yourself to. That's the big dream that keeps you going. And that becomes your story as well.
Yeah.
And story is really important to culture and business success. People buy your story, not your product.
Yeah. Can I just reiterate that's exactly what Nick Halstead said about stories as well. So two absolute sort of joining points there.
Yeah, it's taken me a long while to realise that stories are the basic transport mechanism for information. People remember stories. And they remember the stories about your first sale. And also, again, in startups, keep a journal. Absolutely keep a journal on 2 reasons, and again, this is probably my second thing, is so that you can reconnect with why you started, because as and when you're successful, 2 or 3 years down the line, you will reach a point and go, what was it that we were doing again? And it seems to happen to startups a lot, and they get a little bit lost. Yeah. And I've always discovered that if you can go and dig out the original scribblings that happened whenever it was, in whichever coffee shop it was or whatever, and look at them, the answer is always in those things. Because usually you're a lot more right than you realized. So having some journal to go back and look at and go, oh yeah, okay, this is why we did this, is really, really important to kind of codify those lessons. Yeah. And those stories become what you tell the new hires as well, so they learn about the culture of the business and what it is that you're trying to achieve. And it keeps people going in the same direction. Yeah. Again, startups, that point number 3, there you go. Yeah. Have a really broad funnel of things, have the biggest set of ideas that you can come across, ask lots of questions, explore all the possibilities, and then focus, as one VC said to me every time we met, focus like a laser beam. Yeah. You've got the resource to do one thing, probably, and that's it. Don't hedge your bets. You have to go for the one thing because you haven't got enough resource to do other stuff. And if you're kind of divided and oscillating, it's not going to end well. Yeah. So really big funnel of here's all the possible things we could do, but we're doing this one thing. And stick to it as much as you can.
That rings very true with us, doesn't it? So there's really 4 things, which is good.
Ooh,
yeah.
There we go.
So there's start a cause, not a business. Tell stories, which kind of goes throughout the whole thing. Keep a journal, and I can't remember the 4th.
Ooh.
Oh, laser beam.
Yeah.
Laser beam it in.
Focus.
So I think that's fantastic. I've actually got about 10 other things that I wanted to interrogate you on in detail, but we are out of time in terms of the interview. So firstly, thank you. Absolutely fantastic. Big round of applause for Benjamin Ellis. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And for the Alecki. Look at that. I've worn it out already. Although John Davey has instructed everybody not to ask questions for his mischievous mayhem. No, he's only joking. I'd like to open the floor to questions for Benjamin, and let's see if we can find another microphone. So bear with me a second.
We can manage. But you have to shout out.
I'll shout now.
Yeah,
shout, go on. You've got a loud voice. Right, you said you had 3 missions that you were on at the moment. And you couldn't talk about the 3rd one because or you couldn't talk in detail about the 3rd one because but what is the 3rd bit that you can tell us about?
So, well, how about I trade you? I'll tell you interesting areas right now to look at that are really disruptive. One is the whole way that we run businesses is changing. Most businesses, if you look at mature businesses, are very much driven by repeatable process. If you look at startups, Startups are not about repeatable process. They're about kind of chaos and creating opportunity and those sorts of things. And the way that you manage in that environment is very, very different. If you talk to big companies right now, they are, and they will be for the foreseeable future, trying to work out how they do innovation more. So really what I'm looking at is how you use technology to bring a bit of that startup chaos into the large business environment, but also, conversely, how you bring some of that large business order into a startup without taking away the valuable stuff, and using technology to do that, and moving away from traditional models of process to people-driven models. So startups are all about relationships. And actually, if you look at a large business, the way a large business works, it works about the relationships between the people, right? You say, how does this work? And they show you a hierarchical diagram, right? Yeah. And how does this work? And they show you a process diagram, right? You sit in the office for a day, and what you see is that Dave talks to Philippa because she knows how to route this thing around the system to get this purchase order approved so that, you know, so-and-so can get such and such done. So really what we're doing, building on Master and Panna is codifying some of that and helping that process work faster and helping it work at scale. So there you go. Haven't given too many secrets away, but maybe answered. And other disruptive spaces that are really interesting right now that I'm not playing in. I think one is the whole area of medical technology is fascinating right now. In the technology world, we're used to Moore's law and this kind of doubling, halving type thing. You look in the medical space, you look at the cost, Hammond House was talking at an event last week, the cost of sequencing DNA 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, now. Right, we've gone from hundreds of thousands of dollars to, what's it like, 25, 35 bucks or something that we're heading towards. 23. Yeah, 23andMe. Now, again, you hit a mess of kind of regulation. So you're going to have medical regulation meets technology. That's going to be epic fun, and Google's done some stuff in that space as well. But I think that's going to be really, really interesting and disruptive, partly because we're all living longer and we need more affordable healthcare. So that's interesting. Kind of wearables and kind of software meets hardware is becoming really interesting. And I think that's a real British strength historically. You look at companies like Pace, who made the set-top boxes, were actually quite good at kind of blending hardware and software in very innovative ways. It kind of works well with the British psyche. So I think that's going to be interesting for here. Oh, it's not my phrase. I saw it and thought, that's it. So rather than wearable tech, this idea of enchanted devices, which as a marketeer I thought was beautiful. It does unicorns, yeah. It's like Frodo's sword, I think they were talking about. So they were talking about that at the web earlier on this week, this idea of enchanted devices. But I think that this kind of embodied technology, so kind of going the other way from software that becomes physical again, I think is a very interesting thing. And again, you start to get to wearables, you start to get to fashion. Again, there's another kind of UK type strength. So I think it's a very interesting time for the UK coming up.
I'm going to go on the wearable one. So it's a bit more out there. So we've gone from portable devices to wearable devices. How long have we got embedded devices?
Oh, embedded devices. So again, for me, that's the Meditech thing. And again, it's not my core space, but it's one I'm definitely watching in terms of kind of sticking money into. So we can miniaturize technology, and we're probably not that far off from it being injectable into the bloodstream. There's stuff going off like that already. So yeah, I think that's definitely a space to watch. And it starts to blend with the pharma space as well, which is kind of partly being a kind of UK historic industry. But I think there's lots of interesting spaces right now. We've gone through a period of kind of relatively flat, actually, from a technology point of view, although lots been going off. There haven't been really big, earth-shattering, disruptive breakthroughs in reality. There's been some great stuff, but kind of lift-sharing schemes, that's not kind of planet-changing, to be fair. Injectable technology, very interesting. Wearable tech, very interesting. My area, behavioral software, and kind of using psychology in there, again, very disruptive, very, very interesting.
I've got two questions, actually. The first is, the second one, the first one we sort of covered a bit, which is the difference between the US and the UK, but also possibly the whole, London, Reading, Bristol, Bath, and maybe Swindon in the middle. But there is, where's good places to play and why?
Does this determine whether I'm allowed out in the building alive or not? And what I will say on that one, and this kind of mirrors the US versus UK thing, and kind of London versus Reading versus anywhere else, is that any scenario has got strengths and advantages to it, and enables you to do different things. And so you got kind of two choices. One is to pick your place for what you're doing, or pick what you're doing for your place. So choose whatever the strength of that is. So, for example, being in the UK, one thing that is probably easier to do here, I'd say, than in the US is to launch very internationally. So to go multilingual, to access Europe, to access the kind of rapidly growing kind of Eastern European fringe, to reach into Russia, to reach into Asia, to reach into India, is actually, I would say, relatively easier to do from the UK potentially than the US. So go do that, because a lot of the US organizations leave overseas languages underserved, and that creates a space. Similarly, there are strengths here in terms of the local talent you've got access to, the kind of history of Cisco over there and Oracle over there, and these sorts of things. So each space has got some strength to it. And again, the whole startup strategy thing, it's like, what do you suck at? What's your challenge? Turn that into your strength. So if it's being more remote, I think the great thing about being out here, I guess if you talk to Nick Halstead, is that you get more visibility for your business than you would potentially in the London crowd, lost among.
Although he's taken quite a long time going into London.
It certainly has, and I think that inherently is the conflict. And again, I've kind of been through that mill of people saying, look, move your company to the US, move your company to the US. But location is less important from the physical aspects of it these days, and more important to what do you kind of tangibly have access to. Again, particularly kind of people and network. And this is the one thing I'd say that we really need to build in the UK that the US had wonderfully, is being in the Valley, you had access to people who would help you, who weren't just kind of well-wishers or I've read a blog post, but had kind of been through the mill, learned the painful lessons, and you could learn from their mistakes, and they would share that knowledge with you kind of very openly and very candidly. And also tell you when you're being an idiot as well, which is always a winner. And I think it's taken a long while. It's great to see that kind of building in the UK, but you need community around you of kind of like-minded businesses, because you can learn from their mistakes. And having another business across the desk, a space like this, where you can go, well, we were looking, we've got a lot of Brazilian customers. How do we do Brazil? And they go, oh yeah, we went through that. Watch out for this, this, and this, and this. Is going to save you months. And so having that kind of ecosystem around you, those relationships, is really, really important as a startup.
Any other questions?
What's been the biggest challenge or disappointment in that startup phase for you?
Biggest challenge or disappointment? It's a good question. Actually, a note on questions, and this is kind of a note to myself as well. We're always ready to speak, but always ask questions, and ask meta questions is another trick that I've learned recently, which is just kind of ending at the end of a conversation. So, is there something that I haven't asked you that I should have asked you? Which is a really simple one, but it's a kind of game changer, because a number of times people will come out with a kind of massive insight. What things should I have asked you that I haven't yet asked you? I've heard that from a couple of people, like one after the other, the last few weeks. It's like, yeah, it's a game changer. So disappointments, I think how hard it was to raise money in the UK, that has changed. That has really, really changed now. I think we are at the opposite extreme now, that we really have to watch out for dumb money. In raising money from VCs, it really wasn't about the money. That sounds like one of those things you say, doesn't it? But it really, really wasn't. And in picking a good VC, it was about who could open doors for you. If you had the right VC, they could get you in with the CIO of customer X, Y, or Z, the big name, and they could overcome your scale. They could introduce you to the people you needed. They could find you the right CFO. They could, So that's the value of money. Yes, somebody might bring a few hundred K, 50K, 100K, a few million, whatever, but it's actually more the fact they've now got skin in the game. Right? They're invested in your success, and what they bring after that is way, way more valuable. Conversely, the wrong initial investor is going to close a bunch of doors to you. So I think that's one of the things, kind of watch out the money you take, because what does that mean for the next couple of rounds of funding? If you're diluting yourself out by 20% right now, how much scope does that leave you to dilute out and still be interested in the business, or viewed as interested in the business. So we kind of need to, we're changing now. It's great, there's lots of money, but we need to make sure it's smart money that's going to help your business and that's kind of has a long-term vested interest. They've bought into your cause, right? They haven't bought in because you went through their kind of pitching competition, and some of that stuff is great, but you want somebody who's bought into your cause because they will find you the next set of money.
And pitching competitions not necessarily one of your advised things to do.
No, and I think again something that I think kind of suck at slightly as Brits is the whole pitching thing. And I love that when I go to the US and people pitch businesses, because like you actually know what they're talking about and who their customers might be and where the money's coming from, as opposed to we tend to kind of battle around the bushes for 15 minutes and you're still like, sorry, you sell what to who? So I think practice of that is really, really good. I think practice on sales pitches is more important, probably. Because if you can sell your product and you can show somebody who's interested in buying your product and putting money in the game, the other pitch bit kind of takes care of itself. What are most startup pitches? You're trying to convince somebody that you can convince somebody else to give you money. Right? What if you can convince that person to give you money? And again, I think that's been the fun thing for me with software businesses. Being able to get to cash flow positive in a quarter or in 2 quarters is amazing, coming from an environment where it would have taken a few years. And again, once you've got money, once you're cash flow positive, everybody wants to give you money.
Yeah. I'm still with.
Oh.
No, I'm joking. I'm joking. I think we're good.